We didn't get real far last week.
No, go ahead, we're in the chapter.
This is kind of typical when you're growing and I do this alone, and I ramble, I guess.
Well, I do it here, I think we can do the whole chapter.
I know, you talk faster than me.
Well, when I talk over
You
it.
talk faster without me.
Speed talk. I have lots in my head. And if I ever take a break, take a pause, and
Take a breath.
take a breath, we just keep on rolling.
Let's see if I can organize here. There we go. Okay, so I can read that back there. So we did wrap up John 17 last week.
Read my slide.
I didn't. I deleted your slides. I don't know what it is. It was.
The wrap up for John
Yeah,
17.
John said, I don't think
Jesus cares about you.
Okay.
You're
I
unified.
could have probably figured that out.
And unity doesn't just fall on our lap. We have to pursue it. What are we doing to pursue unity? Yes, there we go. We're ready.
Okay, there it is. I know we got it. There. You talked about it. Yeah, I did talk about my slide.
Oh,
there.
yes.
Okay, and then we kind of like, well, if Justin was here, he would talk about this. But, and then, so then we did jump right into 18. And one thing, the transition from what we've been doing into John 18, I don't think you all probably figured this out on your own. This is not profound, but John 13 through 17 really is very. It's a lot of talking. Jesus talking with his disciples, they ask some questions, but after you get past the foot washing of John 13, then really it's mostly just talking and kind of parsing the words of Jesus. And then we get into John chapter 18, there's more action. We go, from our perspective, talking less about what Jesus says to more about what is going on around Jesus and the things that he's going through. Although there are certainly some words that we'll talk about that Jesus says that we did last week. So in those first 11 verses, talked about where they were a little bit and then showed a map. Then we talked about the power of Jesus' statement when he says, I am he. And, when Jesus says that, they draw back and fall to the ground. So some kind of demonstration of power with those words and the realization of who Jesus is not lost on them as they fall to the ground. And then Jesus, repeats it again. I am he, and I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these go away. And what an unusual circumstance it would be for if you're going to arrest a man that you are suspecting of being a seditionist or a traitor, to allow the people that surround him to go. It's kind of interesting, an interesting tactic that they wouldn't arrest the disciples also, but it's because Jesus told them, let them go, and his words carry power. So that was an interesting part of the discussion. And then we talked a little bit about Peter lopping off Malchus's ear, and the other gospel accounts give us the record there of Jesus healing him, and how that would have been such a surreal moment for them to witness the ear severed, the healing of the ear, and we're going to arrest him still anyway, because that's what we're supposed to do. So just kind of an interesting aspect of things. Tuck that away and keep that in mind also for what we're reading tonight about Peter, whether or not the fact that he has chopped off Malchus's ear makes him more likely maybe to deny being one of Jesus' followers and deny everything there. So that's a little foreshadowing. So anything to add to that first section?
Before we jump away, there's a couple different things that I want to briefly mention. And by briefly, I mean I've limited myself very, very, very far. This is a wonderful section. This is John 18, so the Gospel of John is no longer delinquent. It's grown up. It's an adult. Anyways, John 18. So this is, again, this chapter of action, chapter of things happening. And John basically hits the fast forward. John is likely, again, the last gospel written. He says, you've got a lot of other content in the other gospels. They've been circulating, they've been around. Likely John knows about them, if not all of them, at least some of them. And so, excuse me, there are times in this coming from here forward where he will basically just give us a couple of different extra details Some of them are the same as the other gospel accounts, but he's basically gonna hit the fast forward or the skip to the next scene kind of a thing. And like this, he skips the entire Garden of Gethsemane scene. The garden where, they're praying, there's the different things that happen there. Jesus praying, let this cup pass from me. Yet he still has this, the Father at the very end of this, when Peter cuts off the ears now, because he says, the cup that's been prepared, I'm going to drink it. And so he still has that allusion to this idea that Jesus says, let this cup pass from me. But he basically says, when they speak these words, they go to the garden, and now Judas is coming. And he skips this entire scene, and so he just jumps forward to maybe at different times, at different things, and he does that a little bit with the trials of Jesus as well. But some of the other things that I wanted to make up, to specifically put in here, it'll come up again. I guess I'll talk about some of that in the next slide. But they're in this garden, and I'm going to make reference again. All these things are going to happen again. But there's a sinless man in the garden meeting Satan's representative. And it's, I guess, would be a foreshadowing of a different time when the sinless man in a garden was about to meet Satan's representative. And the first Adam, who is Adam, as Paul would say, he sinned. He entered sin into the world. The second Adam in the garden, where he was, is going to meet the representative of Satan, which in this metaphor, I guess, would be Judas, as he's bringing this crowd of people there. And yet he conquers sin and ends the reign of death. Jesus says, I am he, that's ego in me, and something we'll talk about later. He introduces himself as Jesus. Well, they kind of shout to him, are you Jesus the Nazarene? Now, Jesus, the likelihood of what they're going to go do is arrest. They're going to arrest an insurrectionist. And so they bring a bunch of people. And so I don't know exactly why they bring all of these people, but they have heard of Jesus. They've tried to arrest him before. Maybe they're thinking that he's in this garden, he's going to try to escape. We need people to surround him. It's the whole SWAT team they got to bring in to make sure he doesn't escape. Or they've got to bring in all the people they can to search him out if he's hiding in the bushes or something. But they bring a bunch of people. They bring a whole bunch of people, and again, they fall back on the ground. And I think one of the things about that is that Jesus was showing that just by the words of his mouth, again, the word of God is powerful. Again, we have the word of God, but that's also how God created the universe. He spoke and it became. And so the word of God, when Jesus says, I am he, ego in me, he claims to be God, but that also has an impact on them. But that also goes to show that, if this is a power move of Jesus, he could have just said, ego in me, and then just walked away. If he has the power to knock them over by the voice of his mouth, he has the power to do whatever he wants. This situation is going to continue not as a random occurrence. Jesus is the victim of their plot or their scheme here. Jesus is 100% in control throughout the whole process, and the proceedings here are things that Jesus is allowing to happen. As Jason has on the screen slides there, Jesus protected his own. One of the things that I read about in one of his commentaries I was reading was that throughout this entire situation, it's likely that, maybe likely is, but one of the thoughts that Jesus had is protecting his own. Because in the very beginning, he essentially offers himself up. So instead of, again, as Jason was saying, you just let the rest of the people go that's surrounding this insurrection. That doesn't make any sense, but Jesus offers himself up. He says, leave these alone, but let them go, but take me. And he, again, some have speculated that when Jesus knocks them to the ground by what he's saying, is he is trying to recapture their attention. He's trying to say, it's me that you want. Don't pay any mind to these behind me, essentially. But again, that's more speculation. But he is continuously trying to protect his disciples from this event that is going to occur, the violence that is going to happen. Jesus wants to keep that to a minimum because he has a different mission than to start a rebellious riot here at this garden. Let's see here. Let them go their way. He said that. So Simon Peter, then having a sword, as likely all of the disciples had a sword in different places. He talks about them taking this sword for self-defense, and that is, I have some verses on that if you like those. But he has a sword, he drew it and struck the high priest's slave or servant. We know. So again, they have this conglomeration of people. And this was very interesting. I heard pointed out that when Peter goes to avenge Jesus and really just take down this mob, when Peter says, I am going to go with you until death do us part, Jesus, I am following you all the way, his target, his main theme, his main scheme of how to end all of this is to go after a servant that probably is an arm of the high priest. And it is likely because he said he cut off his right ear. So, Jason, if you would demonstrate here. If I have a sword in my right hand, like I should, and I'm trying to, how would I cut off your right ear from this position? It would
Yeah, I hadn't thought of the right hand, right ear.
be very difficult. Some have said,
Or he's very skillful.
or well, he's a better fisherman than he's a swordsman. It's again, this is postulation, this is total speculation, but it could have been that he was standing behind him and was trying to attack and cut off his ear from behind, and he missed. He's just a terrible swordsman. Because how else are you going to cut someone's right ear off? I mean,
Standing up behind the guy.
well, but if you're going to really take again this, if you look at this as Peter's grand plan of saving Jesus from his mom, he picks a weak dude with no weapon and he hits him somehow in the ear. Either the guy, he was very slow, the guy dodged and he got cut in the ear, or he was coming from behind and the guy dodged. But he's not very effective at saving himself or saving Jesus or saving anything. His plan is doomed from his mom. And attacking a high priest's servant is also a punishable offense that he would have also been drugged with them and probably taken to court for something like this. And so when Jesus heals the ear and reattaches it, it is likely that he had to kind of convince the people to say, hey, I'm going to heal this. Don't take Peter with us. I mean, he's violently attacked another man in their presence. And this is officials from the Jews and Roman soldiers. And so this offense that Peter jumps out there with should have been punished. But when Jesus heals the ear, I assume, again, it's behind the scenes, but it should have been that Peter is dragged with them and also put on trial for assaulting someone else. But alas, they let Peter go, and Peter can follow from a distance. And so I thought that was an interesting, again, Peter's plan failed, it did nothing, and it was likely that Jesus had to defend him to the crowd after he heals this ear.
We talked about some of those aspects last week. We didn't quite parse the identity of Malchus to that extent. But if Peter had attacked one of the Roman soldiers, it would have changed things a lot. Yeah. So it would have been a whole different scenario. And so and also giving Peter maybe a little more credit about what he chose. Maybe he has identified who the real enemy is more so than Rome, because the enemy of the Jewish people, as much as they wanted to think it was Rome, the enemy of the Jewish people, as Jesus demonstrated over and over, religious leadership, as it has been historically through their, through all of their difficulties, whenever they've gone into captivity of some kind, it was always the leadership that led them astray. And so, we take it as Peter's been listening to Jesus enough to know that the real enemy here is not Rome, it's the high priest. And so he attacks his however effectively. He does that attack, he does attack the one who's the real enemy. So there's a couple of angles there we can take on that, or things to look at. But the conclusion is the same, that yes, Peter, even without the attack, it's weird that they let the disciples go. But after that attack, it's really weird that they let the disciples go. And did the fact that when Jesus spoke power in the situation and they all fell down, they had it hold of Peter, thinking, in some way thinking that Jesus is ready to go here, because just by the word he's put them on the ground. So there's another, Peter misread that part of the scenario maybe to think that it was time to attack. So anyways, interesting things to speculate on, because I don't know that we can, come to a final conclusion on any of those things. But it is, the more we kind of let our minds wander into those areas, I think the more meaning the story has to us. So I think it's a good exercise. Okay, so let's take the next section. 12-14. So the Roman cohort, the commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him and and led him to Annas, Annas first, for he was father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people.
So this is, Jason had a nice division here, and he has all these slides in there, and I just kind of encroached on all this stuff tonight. So we'll have a little bit of back and forth, but notice the division of these troops. It's the Roman cohort and the commander and the officers of the Jews. They have that theme, that cycle is going to continue throughout the arrest and murder of Jesus. That it's not just going to be the Jews' fault, and it's not just going to necessarily be the Romans' fault. It's going to be both people, Jews and Gentiles, together crucified the Savior. And so, again, no one's more to blame than anyone else. I mean, obviously the Jews are the ones that really do all this scheming behind the scenes and bring him to Pilate, but from Pilate on, the Gentiles, if you will, are in control as well. The Gentiles are the ones that actually kill and murder Jesus. It's not the Jews, it's the Gentiles, the Romans, that officially crucify him. And again, that gets even more pointed, I guess, later on, that the Jewish method of public execution was by stoning. And so, again, Jesus will say later on that he's going to be given over to the Romans to be crucified because of what he said. The Son of Man will be lifted up. My death will be by crucifixion. And so part of this story, part of this is we're going to figure out exactly how the Romans are going to be the ones, the Gentile people, the Romans in charge, are going to be the ones that kill Jesus, even though he has not committed any law-breaking or anything reasonable for them to kill him in the first place. And so we're getting to pull back the curtain a little bit and see this is what's ultimately happening. But how does it come about? How does the crucifixion of Jesus, rather than the stoning of Jesus that the Jews just get really upset and say, let's stone the, what do you call it, impersonator of the Messiah, the impersonator of the Christ, but rather it's the Romans that will kill him by crucifixion. So we're seeing those layers folded in on how we're going to get from point A to point B. Everybody's to blame. Everybody is to blame. I mean, the Jews do it, the Gentiles do it. We all crucify the Savior.
And if there's one thing that, all along the Jewish leadership has tried in very shrewd and underhanded ways to undermine Jesus, and he always shines a light on what they're doing. I mean, he finds a way to either dodge them or he finds a way to put them in their place or whatever. And if there's one thing it seems like the Jewish officials finally maybe feel like they've done, although they actually don't know this is part of God's plan for it to play out this way, but it seems as though they finally figured out a way to sidestep the idea that the crowds were on Jesus' side. Because one thing that John doesn't record, that the other Gospels record, is how the crowds responded to Jesus at the beginning of this week. As Jesus is entering into Jerusalem and they're laying palm branches on the ground and they're crying out Hosanna to the King, and they're giving him that coronation as he rides into Jerusalem. The officials are wondering, how do we kill this man without turning all those people against us? And by enlisting the help of the Romans to basically be the bad guys as much as they can turn that over, they found a way to sidestep Jesus' popularity. And so they had to. Who did the Jewish people hate more than anybody? Well, they hated the Romans more than anybody, but yet the Jewish leadership has found a way to partner with the Romans to do this thing. And so who was the high priest? Well, depends on who you ask. Annas was supposed to be the high priest. He was by birth, by office, by lineage, he was the one that was supposed to be the high priest. But he had, according to historians, been deposed as high priest from that office by the Romans because he had put a Sabbath breaker to death. And he had done so against Roman law. So the Jews had said, no, you don't get to be high priest anymore. Well, that's not really their say. According to the scriptures, according to Jewish law, the Romans don't get to decide who's high priest. And so because they've got bigger swords than we do and they're more powerful than we are, okay, we'll go along with that. So Annas will sit over here and advise the high priest, who, I'm looking for a word, who conveniently, the ones that then serve kind of in that functionary role as high priest are his sons or his sons-in-law. So Caiaphas was one of 6 sons or sons-in-law of Annas who held that office throughout Annas's life. And so for the rest of his life, which was a long time because this happened, it had already been a period of about 20 years ago that Annas had been deposed from the office of high priest. And so for a period of at least 20 years up to this point, various ones of his sons or sons-in-law had served in that role. And so there's some confusion even as you see Paul at one point, I think, in Acts says, I didn't know this guy was high priest. I thought it was that guy. And they smacked Paul because he didn't know who the high priest was. And so Caiaphas was, kind of the high priest, but Annas really was it. So if you ask the Romans, Caiaphas was high priest. If you ask the Jewish person, well, Annas has been the high priest all along, because nothing happens without his say so. So he's the power behind the throne. He's the one that's doing the real, he's advising everything. But if we want to deal with the Romans, we got to go through Caiaphas, because Caiaphas is the one the Romans recognize as being high priest. So as we kind of have some back and forth between Caiaphas and Annas here through the story, that's why that happens. Anything further for that section? We'll move on 15 through 18. Simon Peter was following Jesus, and so was another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest and entered with Jesus in the court of the high priest. But Peter was standing at the door outside. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the doorkeeper and brought Peter in. Then the slave girl who kept the door said, Peter, you are not also one of this man's disciples, are you? He said, I am not. Now the slaves and the officers were standing there, having made a charcoal fire, for it was cold. They were warming themselves, and Peter was also with them, standing and warming himself. Well, who was that other disciple?
Well, we can never be like 100% sure on every aspect of every detail, but it is very, very likely that, again, this is the disciple whom Jesus loved. John likes to refer to himself in a, I wouldn't say necessarily a third-person view, but just as another disciple, one of the disciples. A disciple whom Jesus loved, another disciple. And again, Peter is brought into this household, and John's like, hey man, I have entrance to this door. So John's like, let's do this. And he walks in there like, let's follow Jesus. And then Peter's left at the door. So John goes back, well, likely John, goes back and says, hey, let that guy in. He's cool. He's good. He can come into the house. And so, likely it was John. I put in little brackets this also with the little question mark on there, because the servant lady, slave girl, if you will. So the servant girl says, you are not also, in this really interesting English, but they're trying to remain as close to the Greek as possible. You're not also one of this man's disciples. What she's asking is, we know that the other disciple is a disciple of Jesus. We know that John follows this man Jesus. We know 100% that this guy follows him. Are you another one of those? Are you also a follower as well? And this is when Peter denies the fact that he is another disciple. Now, we don't know if you're at your Applebee's and you see one of your party members, so you walk back up to the hostess and say, hey, this is my party member, or whatever. We don't necessarily know if John is standing next to Peter saying, hey, let this guy in, and Peter saying, I'm not one of those disciples. But this denial of Peter's is still at least somewhat public. The servant girl he is responding directly to there. We don't know if John is, again, standing there next to him saying, hey, let this guy in, and Peter saying, I'm not one of those disciple peoples. That's not out of the question. That's not. It could have happened, but we don't necessarily know. This could also be just a private conversation between Peter and the slave girl. But we see that as this denial continues on of Peter, it will get more and more vehement. I was going to say vigorous, but I think vehement is a little better. At the end, he is cursing aloud that I am not a disciple of Jesus, and so it's going to continue to build. But this is the beginning.
But I think, I think all of that's, again, we kind of fill in the details with our imagination about kind of the bits and pieces of how this play out, because we know that the overarching story, Peter's in there because John got him in, if assuming this is John, which I think is a safe assumption. Um, and you're right, that it's like, we know, he's the one that got you in the door, we know he follows Jesus. So do you follow Jesus too? No. Well, that's weird. Why did he bring you in here then? You know, because we know Jesus just got brought in, and he's here because Jesus got brought in, and are you just here because you want to stand by the fire with us? That's weird. So, but why would Peter deny following Jesus to the servant of the high priest? Well, Peter's track record with servants of the high priest is not running real strong right now. And there's more, I think, that Peter, I'm not trying to gloss over what Peter does, because Jesus already told Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times. And Peter then, I think, having that fresh in his mind is like, well, I've got to prove to Jesus I'm not going to deny him. And so here come the soldiers to arrest him. How am I going to prove to Jesus that I won't deny him? Well, I'm going to be the one that leads the charge and the soldiers, so Jesus doesn't get arrested. And so he's some of what he's doing, I feel like, is motivated because he's got this chip on his shoulder about not being the one to deny Jesus, and yet that sets him up to be the one that denies Jesus, because now he's got other things that he needs to deny. You don't walk into the home of the person you just took the ear off of and boldly say, I'm here to make sure that you try this man correctly, or that I'm here because you arrested my friend. And so he's kind of put himself in a position where denial feels like the safest route, because I might be arrested next, not just for being a servant of Jesus, but also because I lopped off somebody's ear who was unarmed and couldn't defend himself. And so, there's layers to this if you start thinking about it, that make it easy to understand, or easier maybe to understand, why Peter takes the route that he takes, not just because he's scared and denies Jesus, but because there are other things that play into this that maybe sometimes we don't take into account from details that John gives us that the other gospel writers don't give us. Because he was there, because he was watching these things take place. He saw Peter do what he did. He saw Peter come in. He was there in the presence of or at least in the vicinity where Peter makes his first denial. And so, so I think John does give us some details that we can think about there. You put Greek on my screen.
I did. I wanted to put Greek up there just so you guys can see what Greek looks like. But long story short, the one on the left is ego eimi, which is what Peter's, not what Peter's, which is what Jesus says when they come in. Again, most English translations add the he part. When they say, are you Jesus of Nazareth? He says, I am, ego eimi. That's the same verse. If you look at the Septuagint, you go back to when Jesus or God was introducing himself as the I am, the Yahweh, that covenant relationship, the YHWH. He says, I am, ego eimi. And so when Peter replies, it says, let's see here, I'll go back to that verse specifically. In verse 17, it says, are you not one of this man's disciples? Also, he said, I am not. And again, the response to the people wondering about the identity of Jesus, Jesus says, that's me, I'm the guy, come on. When Peter is asked, are you this man? He says, I am not. I thought there was just a little bit of a, not play on words, but just a specific difference between the two responses to who Jesus is and who Peter is. Jesus, who are you? Are you the Jesus of Nazareth? That's me, I am. Peter, are you one of the disciples? No, I am not. And there's just a very distinct, similar wording again. Obviously it's the same even in English kind of, but there's a big flip, there's a big reversal. Instead of owning up to it, Peter, as in ook, which means no, I am not, is his, what he has said. And I think that's, let's see here, up until the very end of this, let's see here, so he said, and he denied it again and said, I am not. The only thing that Peter says, I believe, we'll have to check this out later, but I think the only thing that we have recorded that Peter would say in this chapter is, I am not. And he says it twice. And then it says, he denied it again, paraphrased. But the only thing Peter gets to say in chapter 18 is, I am not.
All right, so, and I like that, that contrast between, Jesus' declaration is, and his powerful, his assertive declaration of who he is, and then Peter's sort of, at least at first, probably a bit of a whimpering declaration of who he is not, but then he boldens later on that declaration of who he is not becomes bolder as he feels more and more cornered, more and more scared about accepting that position of who he is. Verse 19 through 24, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together. I spoke nothing in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them. They know what I said. When he had said this, one of the officers standing nearby struck Jesus, saying, Is that the way you answer the high priest? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken wrongly, testify the wrong. But if rightly, why do you strike me? So Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So I put that quote in there, I spoke openly to the world, because it's interesting if you think back to the previous chapters 13 through 17, and the number of times we pointed out Jesus' relationship with the world. And there was this constant, there was this constant friction, or this constant juxtaposition of Jesus speaking to the world and how the world responded to him versus how he spoke to the disciples and how the disciples responded to him. And the relationship then that was going to be carried on by the disciples into the world, because the world and the hatred that the world had for Jesus was going to then be poured out upon his disciples because Jesus was going away. So it's interesting here that Jesus, as he addresses the high priest for the first time, says, I have spoken openly to the world, and Jesus will continue to do so in the presence of the high priest. I mean, he declares, or to Pilate, as Pilate questions him, they say that you're a king of the Jews. Yes, that's correct, I am. And so Jesus speaks openly to the world, but how does the world respond? They don't get it. They deny him. They reject him. They crucify him. They kill him. They beat him. And so, who is Jesus declaring that the high priest is part of? He is speaking to the world right now, and the world is going to reject him. And so, I think it's, I'm not sure if it's in this gospel account or one of the other gospel accounts, when Jesus tells Pilate, if I commanded my disciples, what would they be doing? They would be here fighting, but my kingdom is not of this world. And so, we continue to see this contrast between the world that rejects Jesus and the disciples that follow him. And even though we have this lapse, this glitch at the moment where the disciples are confused and unsure, and some of them have left and are not following, and Peter is here, he's denying, they're going to come back, they're going to get it, they're going to return. And so I just found it interesting that John records this specifically, and I don't think these words that Jesus spoke are recorded haphazardly by John. I don't think it's just a coincidence that this is in the story when we've seen that repeated emphasis on the world up to this point, and here Jesus is saying to the high priest, I have spoken the truth to the world, but the world is rejected. So you go find the people who have heard what I've said, who have accepted what I've said, and talk to them, because you don't get it.
So I put two little dashes on there because, again, he said, I spoke openly to this world. I've always taught in public places. I've taught in the synagogues, I've taught in the temples, and I have spoken nothing. I don't have any secret doctrine between me and my inner circle where we're out going to go and take everybody out. If you have something against me, call your witnesses. Call the witnesses. I have spoken in public places. If there are people that have things wrong with what I'm saying, go call the witnesses. It even says that in the next little bit. But what I think he's getting at here is in Deuteronomy 17 and verse 6, it says, on the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses, the one who is to die shall be put to death. But a person shall not be put to death on the evidence of 1 witness. And they have no witnesses currently. They have 0 witnesses that are actually testifying against Jesus. And so what they're doing, again, in our culture, we have like plead the fifth. I don't have to tell you anything about me. I don't have to incriminate myself by saying, well, I did this, I did it this way, I did it this. You have to have witnesses come in and testify about someone. Similar in this day and age, it says the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples. Again, think about this from his perspective. He's trying to figure out who was in his little circle of insurrectionists so he can go and likely kill all of them as well because we need to just end the uprising. But who is Jesus with, and tell him something, give us your teaching so that we can say this is contrary to the will of God, this is contrary to what God is trying to say, and we can trap you in it. And so this trial is proceeding illegally. There are no witnesses. There is no evidence on which they can do this, and yet they're still going to go through with this murder, I guess, would be a good word for it. They're still going to go through this mock trial where there's no witness. And he says in verse 20, so verse 22, he gets struck. And this is not he doesn't get slapped in the face really lightly. I mean, he was struck. And again, I think the ESV says struck with an open palm, I guess. But struck Jesus saying that the way he answered the high priest, because we were just in Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 12 says, the man who acts presumptuously by not obeying the priest who stands to minister there before the Lord your God, or the judge, that man shall die. And I don't necessarily know if the guard is saying, guess what, we got you now. You were disrespectful to our high priest, and therefore you were acting presumptuously. So according to Deuteronomy 17, verse 12, that man that is not obeying the priest, standing before the minister, administering there before the Lord your God, that guy's going to die. I don't know necessarily if that's what's going on there, but the guy says, you know what, essentially what Jesus says is, this is illegal. You call the witnesses, call people. Because the next thing Jesus will say in verse 23 is, if I have spoken wrongly, if you have an offense against me, and again, John uses a specific word, testify. Testify. That's the same type of deal of witnessing, testifying, testimony. And so he's trying to say, call the witness. If you have something against me, then you testify of the wrongdoing. Then you get up in the stand and say, Jesus, you've done something wrong. But if I haven't done anything wrong, why am I being punished? Why am I being struck? And Annas has nothing to say. And that is the end of the conversation. Annas has him bound to Caiaphas. So it is and again, the guy says, this is the high priest, which is not the high priest. Jason already kind of addressed that. But all of this folded in together is, this is an illegal trial. I know it, you know it. And this isn't right.
That's right. And so, just a couple of small observations here. Again, the guard strikes Jesus not because of words Jesus said, but because he didn't like Jesus' tone. I can't argue with words. Jesus has spoken the truth. And so, I think there's probably a sermon in there somewhere if the preacher cares to flesh it out about, how do we respond when we're convicted, but we don't want to yield. When it's our pride or it's our arrogance, our hubris that rears up, and we get defensive. And so we find a way to belittle the messenger, or to take attack we attack the one who brings the message rather than the message itself, because we can't attack the message. And so I think we see that here. I'm going to punch you in the mouth so that you'll stop talking, because I don't like what you're saying, even though that if I can defend against what you're saying, I just do it works, but I can't. And so I'll punch you in the mouth. And so there's that. And I also, this, as we think about what the guard says, when he says, when the officer's standing by Jesus, is this the way you answer the high priest? Well, who's he talking to? What man was there? It was Annas, right? And so, because when he had said this, and therefore he sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Well, so who is it that the Jewish guards view as being the high priest? They still think Annas is the high priest. But now who are we sending him to? We're sending him to Caiaphas because we need him to negotiate with the Romans for us, because that's who the Romans view as being the high priest. And so, so a little bit of back and forth there. And I don't want to go all the way back to the slide that had a picture on it, but remember the high priest residence basically was close to the, close to where the upper room had been, but it's also, or at least the traditional location of the upper room, not far from the temple complex. And it is likely that Caiaphas and Annas, I don't know, and likely that Caiaphas and Annas shared a residence there. And so when he says they sent him bound to Caiaphas, it's not like they had to load him up in a wagon and send him miles away. It's just he walked from one room to another, across the courtyard to another part of that complex. So it's very close in relationship to where he physically would have been. 25 to 27. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, so they said to him, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the slaves, the high priest being a relative of the one whose ear Peter cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Ooh, get warm in here. Peter then denied it again, and immediately a rooster crowed. Peter's low point. This is it. Can you imagine what that rooster crowing sounded like to Peter? Because that's when it comes back to him. And the other gospels record it more dramatically. I don't, some speculate that John left some of that out of respect for Peter, because he was there and saw the look in Peter's eye, or he heard the wail of Peter crying when Peter realized what he's done. But can you imagine being Peter? I think we probably all should imagine being Peter, because we probably at some point can relate to Peter and making that willful denial of something, or that willful step into sin, or that willful step into an area we know we should go, and then having that moment of dawning realization later that that was the wrong thing to do. That was bad to do. That's not what I was supposed to do. And I think out of all the things that Peter does that are relatable, if you don't relate to this one, you're a better person than I am. Because I can see myself in Peter's samples right here.
Peter's trouble. I put on there Peter by the fire, Peter on fire, Peter on fire, randomly because I, just wanted to picture Peter on fire. But the other thing, I've heard this, it was in one of the commentaries I looked at for this section on this idea that Peter was warming himself by the fire. And then after this, Peter is going to be under fire, and under fire is, and people are going to be questioning him. Peter's going to deny Jesus, and it's going to be a rough time for Peter. And then, John 21, Peter and Jesus are going to have a little heart-to-heart, a little chat, and these same people that Peter has just tried to cut the ear off of, in Acts 2, Peter's going to be preaching to. And so we can, again, obviously this is Peter's low point. We can all, again, as Jason was saying, we've all been there. We all need to somewhat sympathize and realize that at times, and again, I think it's Luke that says that as the rooster crowed, Jesus met Peter's eyes. And so again, in the midst of our sin, in the place where we're the lowest, when we're under fire, Jesus still wants us back. Jesus still wants us to do work for us, for Him in His kingdom. That after this event, even after Peter will be at his low point, in the midst of the fire, tribulation, everything that's going on, and he will go out and weep bitterly. And it's going to be a while before Jesus will reinstate him. Obviously, he will be in the tomb for a couple of days, and then even after that, the meeting in John 21, there's some time that passes. But after Peter comes back to Jesus, after Peter and Jesus, they say, you know what, our relationship is restored, and Peter goes out. Peter will be on fire for Jesus for the rest of his life. The rest of his days he will spend serving Jesus. Obviously, again, not perfectly, if the account in Galatians 2, where Peter was being a little bit prejudiced with Jews and Gentiles. But what he was doing was following Jesus faithfully throughout the rest of his days. And again, we have the compare and contrast between Peter and Judas, but Peter will come back. This is not the end of Peter's story. This is not the end of your story. There is a moment where we can all come back and still do great things for God, no matter who we are or where we've been or what's been happening.
I think that's such a key point to the story. You know, redemption, even though this is the whole point, redemption was available for Peter, and later it's offered to Peter, and Jesus, Jesus restores Peter. I think it's absolutely essential that we also know that same redemption, that same restoration was available to Judas. Judas could have come back to him without question. And if some try to make the case that Judas could not have come back, or that Judas was that, the story had to have that person that was unredeemable so that the story made sense. If Judas can't be redeemed, if Judas can't be restored, then the rest of the story is meaningless, in my mind at least. So, the same restoration was available for Judas. That was available for Peter. Peter accepted it. Peter took the right path. Judas rejected the redemption, and look where it led. So, those two paths are laid out before us. We have the choice. Which path do we want? Do we want the path of redemption, or do we want the path of destruction? Because those are the only paths available.
Well, it takes, you get that big knot of pride in your throat, and you've got to swallow it, you've got to let it down, and humble ourselves to God, to Jesus.
Yeah, we have to. And Peter certainly is going to be humbled. Even in this moment when the rooster crows, he is humbled, but later there's a humbling that takes place even in that restoration. And it's a powerful story. I'm excited back into that part of the story. It's one of my favorite stories in all of life. I'm not sure I still understand it completely, but I still love to read it about it. Verses 28 to 32, then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early. They themselves did not enter into the praetorium so that they would not be defiled, but might eat Passover. Therefore Pilate went out to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? They answered and said to him, if this man were not an evildoer, he would not have delivered him to you. So Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. The Jews said to him, we are not permitted to put anyone to death, to fulfill the word of Jesus which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. So they operate here with the pretense of holiness, like they're trying to be right with God. They avoid entering into the Gentile space, a place that would have been unclean, so that they would not be defiled but might eat the Passover. So consider what they're doing. They're doing a sham of a trial, trying to condemn an innocent man, a man that they know has not done the things that they are claiming that he has done, because he hadn't done it. They have no witnesses, they have no proof, they have no reason for putting him to death, and they want the Romans to take that burden of responsibility from them. If we get the Roman guard to declare that he needs to die for sedition, for treason, then we don't have to prove that he's guilty of any sins against the law of Moses, and that takes it out of our hands so that we're not guilty of murder, we're not guilty of entering all these things that they're trying to do is a pretense of them. It's a sham. It's all a sham. Their hearts are black as coal. Their motives are on full display, but we still want to eat that roasted lamb for Passover because that's important to us.
And they want to put him to death, but they can't.
Yeah. and they want to put him to death. They need the Romans' permission. Well, if it was truly a matter of their own, they could drag him outside the city and stone him. But they wanted to crucify him. They're not allowed to do that. So it's just all a sham. It's complete. There's lessons to be learned for it from us, for sure. There's no pretense of holiness. There's no playing around with holiness. There's no threading the needle between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law kind of thing. They're playing games with God's law, and God is not pleased.
Yeah, Lord, and I added that at the very end, they wanted that Roman execution, they wanted the crucifixion, and the Jews, again, they could, according to Jewish law, they could stone someone, but the Romans came in and said, hey, you can't do that, we reserve that right, because, we're the governing body, and we can tell you what to do. And so the Jews cannot kill him, so they can't, Jesus said they have to kind of convince Pilate to do it for them, and they have no evidence, they have no witness, and they basically said, the reason we are bringing him to you is because he's evil. And if he wasn't evil, he wouldn't be doing this. So therefore, he's evil. There you go. Circular reasoning at its best. Anyway, that's essentially their argument was, take our word for it. We have judged him worthy of death. Yeah,
He needs killed.
He needs killed, and you're the guy to do it. So just take our word for it, and you do the killing. So that was kind of their plot.
Yeah, it's not a good look for the Jewish leadership. It's not a good look for the Jewish leadership when the Roman governor looks more righteous than they do, because he's asking questions and he's trying to get to the bottom of it, and he wants real answers, and they're being shady about how they provide it. So when the Roman government official is more innocent than the Jewish leadership, that's bad. That's bad. Therefore, Pilate turned again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own initiative? These others tell you about me?" Pilate answered, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you to me. What have you done?" What have you done? I love that question. Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." Therefore Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say correctly that I am a king. This I have been born, for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" I think we probably should wrap up right there, because I don't want to try to parse all that in 7 seconds. And it is time for us to be done. So,
Pilate says, "What have you done?" Jesus wants to be the king. Smooth kingdom. I want to hear my voice is truth. So truth is good. It is true. Amen. We're done.
that was more than 7 seconds. That was more than 7 seconds. So we will pick up there. We'll pick up with Pilate and Jesus there next week.